Hey, hi, hello, how you doing? For today, I wanted to talk about a medium that is often seen in writing, which is metaphors. Metaphors are used in almost everything, from talking in everyday life to music, poetry, and literature. Many of today's most well-known quotes are written in the form of metaphors. Metaphors are much more memorable than just a normal sentence, and therefore we use them a ton in everyday media. Any writer can use a metaphor, and you don't need to be a professional in order to do so correctly. Because they are often used in everyday life, many people already know the basics of how to use them, and the only thing you really need to do is practice a little bit to hone it in your writing. There are, of course, tips and tricks that you can use to really nail down how to use metaphors in your writing, whether that be from essay writing to something more creative like fiction, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Metaphor can be described as a figure of speech that makes a comparison between two non-similar things. It isn't the same as saying that something is like something else. That would be a simile. A metaphor is saying that one thing is the same as the thing that you're comparing it to. To use an example, saying that laughter is the best medicine or that you're sleeping like the dead. To use an example from Walt Disney's Cinderella, a dream is a wish your heart makes, as well as hell is a teenage girl from Jennifer's Body. Books also have come up with some famous quotes in the form of metaphors. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. From As You Like It from William Shakespeare. The sun was a colder, insistently refusing to go to bed. It was past 8:30 and still light, which comes from The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. The authors are essentially giving a new definition to the word that they are describing. Not by saying that it is like another object, but it is another object. This makes it a metaphor. So why and when should you use a metaphor in your writing? Now, a metaphor is always going to attract attention to the thing that you're writing. It attracts more attention than a regular sentence would, and they are often meant to be memorable, not just to be used in passing, which is why they often make for great quotes. A metaphor engages the imagination more than a regular sentence would. Therefore, it makes it much easier to convey the emotion or image that the author is trying to give to the reader. It also allows us to make connections between two different things. In everyday life, our brain does this constantly in order to make sense of the world around us. Without making connections, the world to our brain is pure chaos. So by using a metaphor, you engage your reader and encourage them to think creatively, which then in turn causes their engagement to go up and want to keep reading your story. A metaphor also makes your writing much more interesting to read. A sentence that might otherwise be flat can be made much more interesting simply by turning it into a metaphor. So instead of saying that someone's handwriting is jagged, you can say, the angles that made up his handwriting were that of a steep mountain range. Hearing that sentence might bring up the image of an actual mountain range as the reader tries to imagine what it is that the author is trying to convey. This keeps the reader's mind busy as well as keeping them entertained. As writers, of course, your goal is to keep your reader engaged. However, that doesn't mean that you should use metaphors all the time. There are right places to use metaphors, and there are places where they simply become redundant and can cause your reader to actually get annoyed because they are so done with the metaphors. Sometimes it is okay to just let a sentence be boring. If it gets your point across, sometimes that's enough. It is important to pick out the moments in your writing where you want your reader to be extra engaged, and then from there decide if a metaphor is the right way to go about it. If you want to pique in attention, it might be a good idea to put it there. But don't just use it purely because you want to make a sentence sound interesting. Therefore, a metaphor should not be forced. If it is, your reader will pick up on it, and they will point it out, with their attention now more drawn to the fact of how forced the metaphor was than what it was actually trying to convey. As you write, and especially as you edit, you might find places where a metaphor could work. It's not something that I would, out of the bat, when you're writing the first draft of your story, worry about. That is a part where you're telling the story to yourself, and it shouldn't be about how to make it the most engaging story in the world. There are, however, moments where a metaphor is more likely to be used in fiction. Metaphors can often be used to describe emotion. Sometimes the emotion that a character is feeling can be so strong that they struggle to describe it, just like we have in real life. Therefore, both for the author and the character, it might be easier to use a metaphor in order to describe what they are feeling. Because a metaphor engages the imagination so much more, it might leave a bigger impact on the reader and make them understand better truly how intense the emotion is and specifically what they are feeling. Not just that the character is feeling sad, but specifically how the sadness feels, how it manifests inside of the character. It can make imagery much more interesting, and the reader might be able to imagine it much better if a metaphor is used in order to describe it. Again, this is not something that's going to work for every situation. You don't need to use a metaphor every time that you're describing imagery, but in some situations, it can help to enhance your writing and help the reader, again, understand what you're trying to convey. Now, there are multiple types of metaphors, and while I can't list them all here, I'm going to name the 3 that I have used personally most in my writing and I've seen many other writers use. Of course, you have the standard metaphor, which is the one that we have talked about so far. You take one object, person, or concept and say, it is actually in this situation the same thing as this, and this is why. A mixed metaphor takes 2 already existing metaphors that we often use in everyday life, or in general more well known, and mixes them together into a new metaphor. It's the same thing as taking 2 colors and mixing them to create a new color. So for example, blue and red creating purple. It takes 2 things that are already familiar to the reader and puts it together into something new, creative, and might actually sometimes work better than making up a whole new metaphor by yourself. Just because it has been used before doesn't mean that you can't use it again for your own purposes. Just make sure not to fully copy it if you can avoid it. An extended metaphor goes beyond just one sentence or paragraph. An extended metaphor goes from multiple paragraphs to sometimes whole scenes or whole chapters. Now, depending on what genre you're writing, this might not work. It is much more often seen in genres like literary fiction than it would be, for example, in a thriller. It also depends on your writing style, whether it is more flowery or more crude and straight to the point. The way that you write a metaphor has to fit within your writing style. And if it is not, sometimes it just may not be the best thing to do. Now, the way that metaphors are used can be influenced by multiple aspects. These influences are both internal and external, meaning that they can come from within the character or outside of the character, for example, their environment or other people. Now, you might say, duh, that's logical, but what I'm talking about is much more in the details and can often affect how you write your metaphor and what words you choose to use. A metaphor is always told from the character's point of view, so therefore you have to understand where that character is in the moment, both internally with their emotions as well as how their outside, their environment is affecting them. Which emotions is your character currently feeling and what is it directed at? Why are they feeling the way that they are feeling? And exactly how would you describe this without a metaphor? This can be influenced by, for example, their environment as well as people around them. Are they comfortable in the situation that they're in right now? Are they in their house where they feel safe and comfortable? Or are they in a completely new place where they have no idea what to do, whether they are safe, and what about their environment draws their attention? Now, a metaphor is always specific to your narrator. For example, a character is not going to make a positive metaphor using an object that they have a negative association with. So if we take one object, character A might use it in a positive way, in a positive metaphor, while another character might use it to make a metaphor about something negative. Now, this is often not the object or concept or person that is at the base of the metaphor, but the object that they are comparing it with. All of these elements make up how your metaphor ultimately is going to come together, and how it is going to influence the scene that you're setting, as well as the interpretation that the reader is going to make of it. So how practically do you go about writing a metaphor? First, identify the object, the person, or the concept that you want to make the metaphor about. Again, people are often only able to see where a metaphor would fit, not while they're writing the whole scene, but when they are rereading it or editing it. So please don't go and worry if you don't find a million places to put metaphors while you're still drafting. Now, why do you think that this is a good place to put a metaphor? Exactly what is it highlighting, and why do you think it is important to highlight using this specific method? Because there are many other ways to heighten the stakes, bring more attention to a certain object, character, etc. You don't have to use a metaphor, so why use it in this case? And just because you want to is not always good enough. You always want to make sure that you use the best methods in order to build your manuscript to the best that it can be. So why is this the best method? Second, you're going to want to identify the object that you want to make the comparison with. This is where you kind of dive into the mind of your character, because why would they choose to make the comparison specifically with that object? Sometimes it can be more simple. Other times it is very specific to their character, who they are, or past experiences that they have had. A good way to know if this is the right place to put a metaphor, again, is to look at your character. Why is your character specifically drawn to this object, this person, or this detail? Why does it stand out to them? Is it because it is a color they like? Is it because maybe it has something to do with their job or a passion that they have? Does it have to do with their hobby? Does the person look like someone that they know? There's always going to be a reason that your character is attracted to the object or concept that you're making a metaphor about. If the character doesn't have a reason to be drawn to it, you shouldn't draw attention to it more than you need to. What your character's attention is drawn towards also tells a lot about the character. So just because you as the author are drawn to it doesn't mean that your character will as well, and therefore that you need to make a metaphor out of it. You can get very creative with this, but again, at times, simple may be better, or it can just logically make sense to compare these two things. And lastly, you can choose to edit a metaphor to be more in your writing style. Again, sometimes direct is just better, but you can also edit them to fit more into your writing style and into your character's voice. Now, how you do this is very specific to the story that you're writing, your character's voice, as well as the type of metaphor that you've chosen to use. So often it can be helpful to first make the base metaphor and then look on how you can integrate it into your story properly. Don't worry about it at the same time. As you do multiple passes of your story, you're always going to come across this metaphor again, and you can choose to re-edit it, or you might get a fresh perspective on how to properly integrate it with all of these elements that I mentioned before. Now, writing metaphors can take a little bit of practice in the beginning, especially as a beginner writer, but after you've gotten the hang of it, it is actually quite easy. I personally consider it to be one of the easier aspects of writing. They can be very fun to implement as the author. It allows you to have a little bit of fun with your writing, and especially maybe if you're a little bit bored with the section that you're at, if you can find a place to put a metaphor in, it's always a way to have fun. In the description box, you're going to find all of the links to all of the websites that I used to help me plan this video. So you can use those if you want maybe a little bit more information or some extra tips and tricks. So I hope that you found this video helpful and that you can use these tips to enhance your own writing. If you did find it helpful, you can let me know by commenting or liking this video. It would really, really help me out a ton. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.